Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to make a brief statement about the G20 Summit in Indonesia. But first, I'd like to address Russia's missile attacks on Ukraine this week. On the very day that I and others confronted the Russian foreign minister across the G20 Summit table with the brutality of his country's actions. On the very day that President Zelensky addressed the G20 with a plan to stop the war, Russia launched over 80 separate missile strikes on Ukraine. The targets were innocent people and civilian infrastructure. The aim: to push the population into darkness and cold. Once again, Russia has shown its barbarity and given the lie to claim that they are interested. During the bombardment of Ukraine on Tuesday, an explosive. The investigation into this incident is ongoing. It has our full support. We've heard the Polish-American president say it is possible that the explosion was caused by a Ukrainian munition which was deployed in self-defense. And whether or not this proves to be the case, no blame can be placed on a country trying to defend itself against such a barrage. The blame belongs solely to Russia. I spoke to President Duda yesterday to express my sympathy and pledge our solidarity. I also spoke to President Zelensky on a joint call with Prime Minister Trudeau to express our continued support. And I met my G7 and NATO counterparts at the sidelines of the G20. We will help our Polish allies to conclude their investigation and continue to stand with in the face of Russia's criminal aggression. Mr. Speaker, the summit took place amidst the worst global economic crisis since 2008. G20 was created to grip challenges like this. But today's crisis is different because it is being driven by a G20 member. By turning off the gas taps and choking off the Ukrainian grain supply, Russia has severely disrupted global food and energy markets. The economic shockwaves will ripple around the world for years to come. So together with other responsible members of the G20, we are delivering a decisive response. Almost all G20 members called out Russia's actions, declaring that today's era must not be one of war. We will work together to uphold international law and the United Nations Charter, and we will act to protect our collective economic security. The G20 agreed to use all available tools to support the global economy and ensure financial stability. That means international financial institutions mobilizing more resources to support developing countries. It means continuing to call out those who exploit their lending power to create debt traps for emerging economies. And it means tackling the causes of rising inflation head-on, including by delivering fiscal sustainability. We pledged our support for the UN-brokered deal to keep grain shipments moving in the Black Sea. That deal, I'm pleased to say, has now been renewed. 2/3 of Ukraine's wheat goes to developing countries. With famine looming, it is desperately needed, and Russia must uphold its part of this deal. We agreed action to improve energy security by accelerating the transition to clean energy, and we launched a new Just Energy Transition Partnership with Indonesia, which will unlock billions in private finance for new green energy infrastructure. And finally, we committed to maintain free markets, free trade, and to reform the World Trade Organization. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I held my first meeting with President Biden. We pledged to redouble our support for Ukraine and to continue deepening our cooperation, including on energy security and managing the challenges posed by China. I met Prime Minister Modi, where we reviewed progress on our forthcoming FTA. I discussed our extension to the CPTPP with the Prime Ministers of Japan, Canada, and Australia, and I met with almost every other leader at the summit, with the exception of Russia. In each of these discussions, there was a shared determination to restore stability, deliver long-term growth, and drive a better future. One where no single country has the power to hold us back. In just a few moments, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will build on these international foundations when he sets out the autumn statement. putting our economy back onto a positive trajectory and restoring our fiscal sustainability. Mr. Speaker, by being strong abroad, we strengthen our resilience at home. So we will continue to support Ukraine. We will continue to stand up for the rule of law and the fundamental principles of sovereignty and self-determination. And we will build a global economy that is more secure, more stable, and more resilient. Because this is what the gravity of the moment demands. And this is how we will ensure that our country emerges from this crisis stronger than it was before. I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. What should have been a summit focused on global economic recovery and delivering clear commitments on climate change was sadly overshadowed by the unjustifiable actions of Russia and their illegal war in Ukraine. Civilian infrastructure targeted across Ukraine and a war of aggression rumbling on as world leaders tried to reach agreement. Whatever the outcome of the investigation into the missile incident in Poland, it is a stark reminder of the danger Russia's unjustifiable war has brought to the border of our NATO allies. We must remain vigilant and united in our opposition to this pointless and brutal conflict. And as I've said many times from this dispatch box, and to the Prime Minister personally, whatever other differences we may have across this House, and there are many, when it comes to the defence of Ukraine, we stand as one. And on behalf of members on this side of the House, well, across the House, I want to send condolences to those killed in Poland. Poland's measured reaction to the incident and the calm heads that have prevailed over the past 2 days is welcome. I listened carefully to what the Prime Minister said about this and agree with him that no country can be blamed for defending itself. We do need to get to the bottom of this, and obviously the investigation is ongoing, but can I ask the Prime Minister when he expects those investigations to be finalised? Russia is losing this war, so I welcome the G20's communiqué, which set out that most members strongly condemn the war in Ukraine. And I ask the Prime Minister, has further support for Ukraine been discussed amongst Western allies? And what efforts are taking place to open a diplomatic roadmap to rid Ukraine of Russian troops and bring an end to the conflict? It is crucial we work to find international unity to further isolate Putin. That will include working with China. We do not underestimate the challenges China poses to global security. And we must defend the human rights of the Uyghur and democracy in Hong Kong. But our approach must be measured, and it is in our interest to work with China on the climate crisis, trade, and most importantly, isolating Putin. I was glad to see constructive dialogue on these issues between President Biden and President Xi. And I'd like to ask the Prime Minister if he believes this summit marks a change in Western-China relations, and whether his government is now taking a different approach from his predecessor to British-China relations. Mr. Speaker, after a decade of low growth in this country, it's crucial we open new trade opportunities. Prime Minister has said he met Prime Minister Modi, where a future UK-India trade deal was discussed. This deal has previously been put in doubt by his Home Secretary, indicating she would not support it. Labour does support a trade deal with India. We believe this can bring new opportunities to promote and create new jobs here in Britain. So can he tell us when he now expects to lift measures overall deal, and so can he guarantee his whole cabinet will actually support it? Can he tell us whether in his meeting with President Biden the UK-US trade deal was discussed, or can we assume that this deal now has no prospect of being delivered any time soon? Lastly, Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Prime Minister whether the Northern Ireland Protocol was raised by either US or EU colleagues? Failure to make progress is hurting British research, development and trade, all at a time when we need to remove barriers for British business. Fixing this issue could lead to a better relationship with our biggest trading partners, an opportunity for our scientists and our exporters, an end to the past 2 years of unnecessary fights and division. So when is he going to deliver? Mr. Speaker, our international alliances have never been so crucial for global stability and our own stability. We on this side of the House know that standing up to Russia's aggression will require further sacrifice. But we must make those sacrifices because taking no action is not an option. The message from all of us must be clear. Ukraine will win and Putin will lose. Democracy and liberty will defeat imperialism again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I start by thanking the honourable gentleman for his words about the situation in Ukraine and Russia, and for his condemnation of the Russian aggression and steadfast support for the government and indeed this whole House's position on Ukraine. He's right to ask about the further support that we're doing. He'll know that we have provided £1.5 billion in economic and humanitarian support to Ukraine, alongside obviously the military assistance. We are hosting a reconstruction conference in the UK next year, and there's an ongoing dialogue about what further support that the Ukrainian government needs from us and others. In the short term, we are in the process of providing 25,000 pieces of winter equipment for the brave Ukrainian soldiers, but also funding to help restore some of the damage done to their energy infrastructure, which I know has been warmly welcomed by President Zelensky. Just to briefly turn to some of his other questions, on China, I very much supported President Biden in his meeting with President Xi. The President and I discussed that meeting at length. I believe that our approach to China is aligned entirely with that of the US and indeed our other allies like Canada and Australia. Of course, China poses significant challenges to our values, our interests, and indeed our economic security. It's right that we take the steps necessary to defend ourselves against them, but it is also right to engage in dialogue where that can make a difference on solving some of the pressing global challenges that we all collectively face. He asked about Northern Ireland. I have discussed this issue with both my European counterparts and indeed the President in various meetings, not just at the G20. I remain committed to finding a solution to the challenges posed by the protocol. It is clearly having an impact on families and businesses on the ground in Northern Ireland. The people of Northern Ireland deserve to have a functioning executive, particularly at a time like this, and it's something that I will devote my energies to bringing about, and I've had so far very constructive relationships with both the President and our European counterparts, including the Taoiseach last week on this particular issue. On trade, I think the broad overarching comment I would make to him is, when it comes to trade deals, whoever they may be with, what I won't do is sacrifice quality for speed. I think it is important. I think it is important that we take the time. It is important that we take the time to get trade deals right. Of course, this government believes wholeheartedly in the power and the benefits of free trade. It's something that we will champion around the world. With regard, I did discuss the free trade agreement with India, and both the Prime Minister and I committed our teams to working as quickly as we can to see if we can bring a successful conclusion to those negotiations. With regard to the US, their priorities are in lots of different areas, but with regard to trade, what we are doing, and the President and I discussed this, we are deepening our economic relationship. The United States is already our single largest trading partner. We're doing more with individual states to broaden our trade relationships, and we've seen recent action on tariffs with regard to steel, aluminium and agricultural exports, all of which is good for the UK economy. And of course, we are in the process of some exciting conversations about joining CPTPP. That is real evidence of our country's commitment to the Indo-Pacific region. Is something that is supported by the Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia and Japan, and hopefully we can bring those negotiations to conclusion in the near future. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, I just say that my reflections on the summit and indeed on attending COP are that the United Kingdom is at its best when we are an engaged and active member of the global community, where we are standing up for our values, where we are defending our interests, but also spreading prosperity and alleviating poverty and suffering. I'm pleased to have had conversations with so many leaders over the past couple of days. It confirms to me that they very much welcome the UK support in achieving all of those objectives, and that's what this government will set about doing.
Chair of the Select Committee, Alicia Kearns.
Dialogue is never weakness. So will my right honourable friend tell us when he intends to reschedule his meeting with Xi Jinping? Because this is not an endorsement of the Chinese Communist Party, but an opportunity to set forward our red lines, particularly on the hostile actions we've seen on UK soil in the last month. But we do also need to see shortly a strategy from the Prime Minister on China. Will he also inform the House what progress is made at the G20 on isolating Russia, with India and other nations who are not as aligned with us on Ukraine, because they are key to global stability and also to ending bloodshed?
Well, I thank the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee for her excellent question. She's absolutely right about the importance of dialogue. She would have heard what I said to the Leader of the Opposition. We are in the process of refreshing our integrated review, and no doubt our approach to China will be a part of that. But in the meantime, she's right that dialogue also offers the opportunity for us to raise issues of concern, defending our values and interests, particularly with regard to areas like Hong Kong, which we will continue to do as the opportunity arises. She's also right to point out the position of those non-aligned countries. I think we should all take enormous comfort from the fact that the G20 communiqué was actually agreed. It was substantive, comprehensive, and contained strong language of condemnation about Russia's aggression. That was by no means assured just a week or so ago, and I think speaks to the feeling in the international community, something that I saw across the G20 table, as many, if not all, almost all countries took the opportunity to say something about Russia's actions and join us in condemning it. But there is always work to do, and we will continue to have that dialogue with those partners.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. Mr. Speaker, with the Russian military continuing to fire deadly missiles at civilians right across Ukraine, I sincerely hope that Putin's foreign minister was made to feel the justified anger and disgust by those attending the G20. And with that in mind, can I begin by asking the Prime Minister what progress has been made at these summits to further isolate Putin's regime on the international stage? The whole world must stand together on Russian sanctions, and we must make sure that those responsible for crimes against humanity face justice. And what progress has been made to ensure there is no weakening in the international resolve to stand with Ukraine until the victory for their people? Mr. Speaker, in terms of G20 discussions on the economy, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor keep referring to the global factors to blame for the financial crisis facing families across these islands. It's the excuse that they are using to impose austerity 2.0 on today's financial statement. But if this is really all to do with global factors, can the Prime Minister explain why the UK is the only G7 economy that is smaller today than it was before the pandemic? Why is the UK the only G7 country enacting austerity 2.0? The reality is this is a political choice. And finally, on the proposed Indo-Pacific trade deal, the latest Brexit fire sale that threatens to sell out our farmers and crofters. Not only this evidence continues to mount that the Brexit effect to reduce our economy by 4%, a factor that is driving Tory austerity. Just week we heard from the former DEFRA Secretary, who retrospectively ripped apart the trade deal with Australia and the damaging impact that will have on our agri-food sector. A deal, I would remind the opposite benches, endorsed by every single Conservative MP. So can the Prime Minister explain to Scotland's food and farming industries why he is so committed to pursuing yet another Brexit deal which will deliver a hammer blow to their businesses?
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the honourable gentleman's comments about Russia and Ukraine. Thank him for those. He should be reassured that the Russian Foreign Minister felt, I think, the full assault of allies, including the United Kingdom, in Putin's absence, of the absolute outrage that the international community feels at what is happening, and that will continue to do so when Russia attend these fora. With regard to farming, look, this government is an absolute champion of British farming and farmers. It will remain the case, and it will continue. And it will continue to find opportunities to put great British produce on the tables of many more families around the world. And that's what we will continue to do. I'll just briefly address his comments on the economy, because I just point out, I mean, he had a few different stats. It's worth bearing in mind that we've just come from a G20 summit where 2/3 of those G20 members sitting around that table are experiencing inflation rates north of 7%. The IMF predicts that 1/3 of the world's economy is already or will shortly be in recession. And if he took the time to read the G20 communique, he will see that actually the global picture is very clear. Countries around the world are grappling with high energy prices, high food prices, and rising interest rates. And indeed, many countries around the world, like us, have committed, as does the international community, to ensuring fiscal sustainability as a path to improving those. That is absolutely the challenge that we confront. It's absolutely the challenge that the Chancellor will meet head-on, and we will make those decisions with fairness and with compassion.
So this Defence Select Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I strongly welcome the Prime Minister's words at the G20 in condemning Russia's aggression in Ukraine. I've just returned from Odessa with the Defence Select Committee, where there is huge appreciation for the British efforts in supporting Ukraine at this time. But just 1/5 of those grain ships are able to get out compared with prior to the war. And with Russia's maritime force severely diminished, Odessa is calling out for a new, more efficient grain deal. Would the Prime Minister agree to meet with me to look at securing a UN General Assembly resolution bypassing the Security Council, which would grant Odessa humanitarian safe haven status and the formation of a UN-led maritime force so those vital grain ships can be escorted safely out of Odessa?
Well, my honourable friend is right to highlight the importance of the grain shipments through Odessa. I'm very pleased that after concerted effort on our part and other allies with the United Nations Secretary-General, the grain deal has indeed been extended, which was in some doubt just days ago. I think that demonstrates the pressure that was put on Russia by the international community. He knows the importance of the free flow of both food and fertilisers to the developing world through those ships. I'd be delighted to meet with him to see what more we could do, but I think for now we should be very pleased that the grain deal is being extended. It's already seeing a decline in wheat prices, and that will bring some alleviation to the food inflation that we're seeing, particularly in the African continent.
Chris Brown.
Mr. Speaker, Putin's aggression was allowed to prosper for too long, ever since 2008, you could argue, so I completely support what the Prime Minister has said and done in supporting Ukraine against the barbarism of the Russian Federation.